Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this event in National entitled City Living, because it is about cities and living standards. You see what we did there. My name is Torsten Bell. I'm the director of the Resolution Foundation. For those of you that don't know, well done for turning up. The Resolution Foundation is an organisation that focuses on improving the living standards of low and middle income households. Now, today's event starts from two insights. One is substantive, and one is slightly tongue-in-cheek. And the substantive one is that, to put it bluntly, too often Britain's cities are a disaster when it comes to living standards. And unlike most countries, almost all of our cities, with the exception of Bristol and London, have below average living standards for the country as a whole, and that is not the case in most other developed countries. That's the serious one. The second one is that, just like blind dates, devolution has something in common with them, which is first impressions matter a lot. And by first impressions, I mean that we're about to get a first generation of city mayors, metro mayors, mayors, whatever you want to call them, next May, in between 4 and 6 of our city areas. Those people and what they do is going to matter, not just for them and their political careers and for the cities they are in charge of, or in charge of, we're too focused a word for what they're going to be doing, but anyway, that they are responsible for, and it's going to matter for the future of English devolution, because, if we're honest, a lot of the public has an open mind about whether or not this is a good idea, what it means, and how much of a success it's going to be, and it's going to be for those handful of individuals, less than half a dozen, to show that they can actually make a difference. In many ways, it's going to be about the change they deliver, not just about the powers they demand, however much all of us are in favour of more powers being devolved. So that's the kind of impetus for why we're here today. Just to introduce our panel and the order of speaking. So Stephen Clark is an analyst at the Resolution Foundation. He leads a lot of our cities work. He's going to just set out the headlines for our report, because I already know you've all have read all 50-odd pages of it, but we'll try and get it into 5 seconds or so. Then Lord Jim O'Neill is going to give us 10-15 minutes. Jim had a long career at Goldman Sachs prior to becoming Commercial Secretary of the Treasury for the last 18 months.
There was a 3-year gap.
3-year gap, okay, fine. Let's start with do you want to give people an update on your life? Fine, let's leave it there. We'll leave the gap in the career there. And he's now a crossbench peer, and I mean, all of you will know, but Jim obviously has led a lot of the energy and the debate on cities, both pre-government with the Cities Growth Commission, and then in government, where he was the minister responsible for all the good bits and not the bad bits. Lucy Powell MP is the MP for Manchester Central, and until recently was the Shadow Education Secretary. Lucy likes Manchester a lot. Now, we've got a problem here, which is both Jim and Lucy both like Manchester a lot. So we're going to try and contain the level of Manchester love. We will try and balance it out with some very bad points about Manchester.
We're going.
Because basically most of the country has had enough of the Manchester love. And then to balance it, not me, I'm just saying most of the country. I'm in favour of it, obviously. The rest of them have had enough. Anyway, and then Alex Jones.
Are you related to the Prime Minister?
Not so much. Jim, it's quite early to start. That's news already. I can't have the journalists leaving before we even start. You've already given them their story. Anyway, and Alex Jones is the Chief Exec of Centre for Cities and has done a lot of the leading thinking on cities, what powers they should have and what they should do about it, and brings a much needed rigour to the debate that is often slightly on the ideological end of the market. So we're very glad to have all of them. Then we have all of you. I'm not going to introduce you individually, but you'll hopefully have lots of good questions / statements, which is what most questions at think tanks events verge into, but then with some self-control from you, we'll get some answers from the panel. Stephen, you're up first. Slides, lead us off. Yes, Captain.
Yeah, I'll try my best. So in this presentation and in the report itself, I'll be discussing city regions, and these differ a little bit from kind of the urban central areas of these cities, so bear that in mind. As Torsten already said, next year 4 city regions will elect mayors, 2 possibly will also elect mayors, and so given this, we thought it was very important to start investigating the living standards challenges in some of these areas. Right, so first of all, apologies. I know it's an RF event, but I'm not sure we've ever had 4 slides on the first chart. 4 charts on the first slide. However, the basic takeaway of this is that, as Torsten said, economic performance in Britain's major cities is worse, quite significantly worse than similarly developed countries. The top 5 largest cities for each European country are shown, And you see in Britain only one, and that's London, as GDP per capita, which is significantly above the average. That is not the case in France, Germany, and Italy. However, obviously GDP per capita is an imperfect measure of living standards. And so, looking at perhaps a more measure that means more to the average person, here is median earnings in Britain's major cities. And we see again that London is an outlier. However, most importantly, we can note that west of England and Glasgow are the only two cities in which median earnings are higher than in the rest of the country. And on many of these slides, the rest of GB just means the areas in Great Britain which aren't in the city regions. So, obviously, there are other things that matter to people's living standards, whether they're in work, the taxes they pay, the benefits they may receive, and costs they pay, one of which obviously is housing is a major one. We know that on many of these measures as well, Britain's cities are struggling relative to the rest of the country. And again, it's the major cities I'm talking about here. Benefit spending is higher as well, and so cities will be more affected by the planned reductions in working age support. And although the housing crisis, which is well known and well talked about almost incessantly in London and starting to be talked about in places like Bristol, it is starting to spread to the rest of the country. Some research we did earlier this year showed that home ownership has fallen most in the Greater Manchester region over the last 10 years or so. So again, there's more headwinds to come on housing. And I think this really speaks to the point that these mayors, as it were, will be judged on how they address these issues. And therefore, whether or not and to the degree to which they address these issues will, in some respects, mean for the average person whether they think devolution has been a success or will be a success for them. So in the report, we take a specific look at employment. This is for a number of reasons, one of which is that employment is a particularly inclusive way to boost living standards. This is because when employment grows, it is usually those who are less connected to the labour market, usually those who are lower down the income scale, who move into jobs. Those who are well paid, those who are in the higher parts of the income distribution are by and large always in jobs, and so when employment grows it is a very kind of pro-poor way of improving living standards, very progressive. We also normally expect tight labour markets to lead to wage rises, although we haven't seen that so much in the recent crisis. And also importantly, we wanted to look at employment because the new mayors will get a lot of significant powers over employment and the ability to address some of the issues of unemployment in their regions. Okay, so the main takeaway from this is that employment gains have not been equally shared across Britain's cities. We know that Britain has experienced a big boost and boom in employment in the last 5 years or so. It's been talked about as a jobs miracle, but the jobs miracle hasn't been present everywhere. Most concern is that if you look in the bottom left quadrant, the red quadrant on the screen, you'll see that 6 of our large northern, except for the West Midlands, cities have low relative employment levels and have seen sluggish jobs growth since 2011. Only 2 cities you can say have done well in the sense that they have both significantly increased their employment rate and they also have relatively high employment rates. And the relative was to the middle is the city region average. So only Nottingham and London have done particularly well since the crisis. The west of England has very, very high employment, as we see in the top left. However, perhaps because of this, it's not seen huge rises in employment over the period. So why does this happen? Why is this the case? Well, it's partly a cause and partly a consequence of the fact that within these city regions there are even larger differences than between city regions in the levels of employment. So on this chart, up the left, each of the rows is a city region, and each of the little diamonds is a local authority within that region. And we see that the spread of those diamonds along the rows speaks to the variation in employment rates within the city region. So we see that Manchester really stands out, London stands out, Nottingham, Cardiff stand out. We see that in Nottingham, for instance, and this is the Nottingham city region, as I said at the beginning, the wider area. Rushcliffe has an employment rate well above the national average, close to 80%, whereas in the centre of Nottingham it's down at 65, almost 10% below the national average. Trafford and Rochdale kind of tell the same story, and it really speaks to the fact that, yes, we've seen very important boosts to employment, but these haven't been felt by lots of people in some of these cities. And why do we see these big variations? Well, we know from our own research that it's really about certain people. There is perhaps an idea that it's more the case that some of these areas are just generally perform better, they generally have better labour markets. However, the evidence suggests that it's not really the case. If you look at the different groups that we are looking at here, so again, different groups are on the left, on the rows, and the diamonds show the performance of those groups in each city region. So a diamond represents a city region. We see the high-performing group, which we dub them the high-performing group, and these are white, middle-aged, relatively well-educated people, and they are in jobs pretty much wherever they are in the country. So they're in jobs in every city region to a very high degree, 90%. And also, although it doesn't show us on this chart, if you look at every local authority in these city regions, so that's about 110 local authorities, the employment rates for these people doesn't dip below 80%. And generally it's about between 85 and 95%, so that's very, very high. So we know that actually the variation between and within cities is down to these other groups. So non-single mothers, the older workers, younger workers, and so on. And there are big variations. Particularly, I've picked out just two here, which is ethnic minority employment in the Tees Valley is one of the lowest, is the lowest of all the city regions. And employment rates for disabled workers is a big concern in Liverpool. Although as you can see, there are other local authorities where it's city regions where it's a big problem as well. So we wanted to really investigate what we can expect from improvements in employment and what we can perhaps expect from these city mayors. And so as this was the beginning of the project, I'm not going to outline a range of solutions to the problems I've just outlined. However, I am going to tell you about two scenarios that we looked at, which is one, what would be the boost to employment if cities were able to narrow the gaps between each other? So if cities which had lower employment rates were able to move up. And also what would happen if local authorities within cities were able to move closer to the best local authorities in their city region. This provides what I think is a more kind of realistic challenge to pose to cities and shows what the payoffs could be from narrowing these gaps. Now obviously local city leaders won't choose binarily one of these things. Most leaders will want to move both their city up and also narrow the gaps within their city, but it shows some of the relative payoffs of these approaches. To do this so that it wasn't arbitrary, we really wanted to ask, well, how could employment rates improve if the kinds of people I spoke about in a couple of slides ago, if their employment rates were similar to those in other parts of the country for the same people? So for instance, we want to see really if a disabled worker in one part of Manchester can have the same opportunities as a worker in another part of Manchester, or a lone parent in the West Midlands. What would the employment rate be if they could have the same opportunities as a lone parent in Bristol, say? So we're not asking people to have employment rates which are seemingly beyond what their group has. We're asking them to perform as well as they do in other parts of the country, so narrowing these gaps. And so doing this, we see that this is just a graph of the employment rates for these city regions in 2015. And as I said, we wanted to look both at how the employment rates would change if you narrowed the gaps between city regions, but also we found that actually the biggest gains for cities occurred if cities became more equal, if gaps between local authorities in city regions were narrowed. And we see that the gains are very significant. So Manchester there gains the most, and this speaks to the fact that, as I showed you on the previous slide, Manchester has some big disparities in employment rates. For instance, if all the low activity groups I were talking about, if they all performed as well in Rochdale as they do in Trafford and Stockport, then the employment rate in Manchester would go up to above 78%. And obviously this would be a huge, very big increase, but even if performance improved to half of this extent, we would see big improvements. The reason why other cities do less well is because they suffer from less within city gaps. So the West of England does very well across the 4 local authorities that make up that area, and the same goes for London, which is really narrowed its gaps within its local authorities in the last 10 years. So that's what this shows, and we show that roughly you would add about 750,000 jobs if cities were able to improve their performance in this regard. But as I said, different cities do have different priorities, and the exercise we undertook showed what some of the trade-offs could be. So we found that really different cities should pursue different strategies. So for instance, Tees Valley, while it's relatively equal in the sense that the local authorities that make up the region have similar performances on employment rates, the gap between the Tees Valley and other city regions is very large, and therefore Tees Valley would actually benefit more from overall improvements in the employment rates. By contrast, as you see, Manchester, which is in the blue triangle, and Liverpool, because of the disparities in employment rates in these cities, actually narrowing those gaps will have a much bigger payoff than if Manchester was to try and improve its average employment rate so it's closer to, say, the west of England. So this hopefully gives an idea of what some of the priorities can be for these new mayors. And I just want to finish off with posing 6 possible challenges. As I said, this is the beginning of the project, so we don't have all the answers, but we can see already some of these important broad brush themes emerging. It also means, as I said, that this actually I think really speaks to the fact that devolution this actually is a defence of devolution itself, because once you start to really analyse these areas, particularly looking within the city regions, you see that the problems they face are very different, and so perhaps a national approach to solving them has run out of steam. So I think this is an advocate of devolution, but it also means that, as I said at the beginning, mayors will be judged on how much they solve the relatively unique problems their cities face. That was a very quick tour of the research we've done. As I said, it was 50 pages, so you can all go away and read those, I'm sure you will. As this is the beginning of the project, we're really looking for new ideas and to work with others, hopefully many of you in this room. And I also look forward to what the panel will say, because as I said, it's the beginning, we are in the exploratory stages. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. And thank you for the one-line manifestos at the end. That was the, as someone I've actually written a manifesto, everyone would benefit, both people writing them and people reading them if they were all limited to one sentence. Yeah, make everyone's life much easier. Now, your speech isn't going to be limited to one sentence, Jim, I hope. Otherwise, we're going to have a very quick event. Over to you.
Thank you, Torsten. Good morning. Thank you to David Willits for inviting me in the first place. If I recall correctly, this is one of the things I was going to be doing this morning when I was still a minister. It's one of the very few things I still wanted to do since I've stopped being a minister. It's actually, I think, only the second time I've said anything about these matters. The other was in a brewery in Stockport, which surprisingly didn't have that many people from the media there. Didn't have a lot of people there, other than those wanted to drink, actually, but there you go. I'm going to say, I'll cover 4 areas, or maybe sort of 3. I thought, first of all, I'll say a few things about the Northern Powerhouse, then I'm going to touch on devolution and within it the issue of mayors. So firstly, with respect to the Northern Powerhouse, I thought I'd do this because throughout my 18 months in office, and indeed since, there still seems to be a lot of generalised things that are said about it, which, at least from my perspective, and I think of myself as being somebody that was right at the core of it being created, a lot of it is a bit wide and mock. Notwithstanding the extremely powerful points just made, the Northern Powerhouse arose because if you look at Britain in a global context, we have one city that matters in the world, and that's London. London is the only British city that registers in the top 50 cities in the world. If you're very generous about the definition, Greater Manchester and Birmingham get into the top 100. And my background obviously comes from global economics. For the past 20 years, at least 60% of global economic growth is driven by urban places. So when I was tasked to chair the City's Growth Commission, which is one of the things I was doing in between my life at Goldman and becoming a minister. We tried to think of what could be done to make a difference. And this is a quite sensitive thing I'm about to say, and it often has been when I've said it before and during government, but it is true that if it weren't for the adjacency of some northern cities to Manchester, there would be no Northern Powerhouse. And in that regard, I guess the overriding thing I would say, the real way to think about the power of the Northern Powerhouse story, in my view, is primarily economic and social, and not really in terms of politics, but obviously politics often gets its big voice in the way these things develop. And I'm very fond of saying in that regard, the way I think about it is to somebody that spent quite a bit of time on strange acronyms. Northern Powerhouse is really all about what I call man, chef, leads bull. And contrary to what Torsten said at the start, the reason why we are nowhere near finished talking about Manchester is Manchester geographically is in the middle of those places. And if you take the radius or the area between Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, that is about 7 to 8 million people. And if you can get that group to start behaving, not as necessarily one city, but the same place in terms of activity as consumers and producers, it could become something that would be a game changer in terms of the future of the British economy. And it is the fact that that is at the core of what the Northern Powerhouse really should be about. It's certainly how I drove it and encouraged the ex-Chancellor to sort of embrace the idea. It was his title, my idea. And I think it's very important because it sometimes gets lost in the understandable and justifiable politics to not exclude everybody. Frequently the Northern Powerhouse is regarded as the North. And of course it is important that nobody is excluded, but it is the uniquity of that geography that makes it so special. And last thing on it, as I'm fond of saying, and many people are not aware of this, the distance between each of Liverpool to Manchester, Leeds to Manchester and Sheffield to Manchester is shorter than the Piccadilly line, the Central line and the District line. And at the core of many things that make it possible to function is what I used to call the Northern Oyster. A very important thing that is often not known is since the oyster was introduced in London, the movement of people around Greater London is about 20% more than it used to be. And if you can get some kind of effective technology to allow all these 7 to 8 million people to start doing that happily and cheaply and with affordability, that is crucial to the whole thing about agglomeration in terms of generating something that makes a difference. So that's the sort of background. In terms of evidence that I was going to touch on, but particularly in view of the really interesting and very important data about the disparities within places, I've obviously been asked frequently about where is the evidence that not only is this for real, isn't this just some political slogan, or is it actually working, will it ever work? And I think the truth of the matter is that it will take a generation before there's really any evidence whether the Northern Powerhouse is working or not. I occasionally have been fond of, during a lot of this time I was also leading a review on a global basis into something called antimicrobial resistance. I would sometimes slightly facetiously joke that solving antimicrobial resistance would be easier than achieving success with the Northern Powerhouse. Not least, there's only 193 countries to deal with, whereas with the Northern Powerhouse there's a lot of people with lots of views. But that notwithstanding, and I really, because at the core of it, and it's something that the Resolution Foundation wonderfully stands for, is we've got to do something about those that are most disadvantaged, and you're not going to be able to do that until we do something effectively and seriously about skills and education, and that you can't do that on the back of a couple of budgets. However, that notwithstanding, and importantly, there is some evidence that parts of the Northern Powerhouse economy are starting to improve relative to the rest of the country. It is not very well known. even inside government, never mind by any others. But the monthly purchasing managers indices in the arcane world of economics is probably regarded by many, certainly myself, as one of the best and most reliable economic indicators. We actually have those on a regional basis. For the past 12 months, and it was not the case before that, the Northwest PMI is actually stronger than the national PMI. And notwithstanding your important points about employment differentials, unemployment in the Northwest is below the national average too. That could be for a whole host of reasons. It might have absolutely nothing to do with anything to do with the Northern Powerhouse, but I suspect it might be reflecting some of the powerful anecdotes that those of us that have been immersed in it, that there is stuff going on that wasn't going on before. You see it in terms of foreign direct investment, obviously with another hat on in my past role, but also linked to this, I used to travel around the world to places that are an important source of FDI, and there was an enormous amount of interest in the Northern Powers, particularly from China, also from the Middle East, partly because of a certain football team that happens to be located there. And there is a lot of evidence, I think it's the KPMG annual survey of FDI showed, that I didn't realise till I read it there, that over the 12 months ending last year, FDI into the Northern Powerhouse was 140% higher than it had been the year before, which is very important and a slightly unfortunate consequence, but the messaging of how this is placed as a priority, in my judgment, is just as important as how much the government does or doesn't spend on the Northern Powerhouse, because what you really want to see happen is private business people and individuals driving all of this stuff for themselves because they really believe it. So let me quickly go on from that to devolution, which has been an exciting central part of this. And the overriding thing I would say, it is a necessity, but not sufficient to determine its success. But as you heard and saw, I think very clearly there, to really deal with a lot of these challenges in parts of all of Britain, not just urban, but certainly urban Britain, it is sort of crazy to assume that some genius in Whitehall is capable of knowing the solution for all these different places, where, especially because the reality is the solutions are different in many of the places. And that is the core, along with the fact that we are the most centrally run country in the OECD, as to why it is so obvious that we are closer to the beginnings of devolution, in my opinion, rather than the end. Quite what the path is going to be like, of course, remains to be determined, including, as I'll come on to in a second, what happens about MERS. And I won't waste time saying all the obvious things that can be devolved more, some of which have not. And here, it may seem as a bias, but I'm going to say it. Another reason why you can't ignore Manchester is because they have had the boldness, possibly helped by the fact they've had very stable political local environment, but they've had the boldness to push with credibility and very persuasive arguments for more things to be devolved than has come from any other part of the country, possibly including London. And that is something that, in my opinion, should not only be respected but should be admired, and influencing the ways that other people think about it. Because if this is really going to work, you can't, and it links very much to the mayoral thing, which I'll finish off in a second, you can't seriously expect central government to hand over these powers and these responsibilities, which at the end of the day will relate to our national debt, unless you've got people with the right boldness and vision and preparedness in terms of accountability to actually handle the responsibility that they want. Which takes me lastly briefly to the mayoral situation and the 2017 election, which is obviously going to be an extremely important moment. I think I heard you say we have 4, maybe 6. I'm still 4 weeks out of government. I hope it is 6. I'm not sure what's going on with the other 2, but
There's a court case in South Yorkshire.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Politics, I'm afraid.
So it's interesting that you respond with that phrase. In my judgment, there should be at least 4 more. But going back to what I said at the start, and crucial for this journey, we have to, it might well be that how the mayoral elections next year go will determine this, but I think for the health of the long-term future of the country, and in my opinion, this issue is at least as important, if not more important, than Brexit. Certainly, it has become even more important as a consequence of what the country decided in July. We need to somehow stop the historic partisan nature of central politics in allowing what is the right thing. We would have had more mayoral potential candidates if it would not be for the nature of national politics and how a lot of people in Whitehall immediately think of these issues as politics and not economic and not social. And it's true, in my opinion, with the votes in the North East, which went 4-3 recently against. It's primarily because of the dominance in the background of Labour Party politics, not actually wanting that to happen, in my opinion. And in the other cases, it's probably true because it was complex for Tory politics to think of the risk of yet more so-called Labour mayors. And in that regard, any of you that are from these places and would like to stand as an independent person, go ahead, because what we need in all these places is people with the vision and the passion to change the game from what it has been for at least all of my life, and maybe many others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. That was a good sales pitch for the Northern Powerhouse, a good sales pitch for devolution, and a good sales pitch for mayors, and a massive sales pitch for Manchester, despite all the pleas not to do so. But anyway, I think you've made the case. Now, Lucy, with the similar self-control on the Manchester front.
Oh, right. Is that it? Is that my intro?
That's it, that's your intro.
Oh, right.
Go.
Thanks very much for that generous introduction, Torsten. I used to work with Torsten, so I know him well. And I'm straddling this, it's all right, I'm going to do a sort of George Osborne straddle here. Well, I concur completely with everything that Jim has just outlined there, especially that obviously Manchester is the centre of the universe as we know it, but we'll leave that to one side. I'm really here to sprinkle a little bit of politics on this debate. I think the report that the Resolution Foundation has published today is a really important one in showing the particular responsibility and duties that there will be on these first generation of mayors and how their challenges are different in different parts of the country. And I think that's the critical point about devolution, as Jim says, that it's not a one-size-fits-all programme, and that's exactly why we need devolution and we need Metro mayors, in my view, to help bring that to life. So I just want to briefly talk about the political challenge and some of the political opportunities that these first generation Metro mayors will have. Firstly, in terms of the challenge, as I get on the doorstep quite regularly, there are many political challenges that these first generation mayors will have, not least that they are not wanted at all by most of the population and the public, even in central Manchester where I represent. Many people will say to me on the doorstep that didn't we vote no for a mayor just a few years ago, and now we're getting one that we haven't voted for at all. So you may remember in 2012 there were a series of referendums that were imposed upon cities by the government for the local council areas to have mayors. So Bristol opted for that, but Manchester and I think most other cities voted no. So that's a big challenge there as well. I think the public feel that this is just an extra layer of bureaucracy and political management that they don't need. And a really key challenge, I think, for the new mayors coming in, as somebody said to me just a couple of weeks ago on the doorstep in Newton Heath, which is one of the poorer parts of my constituency, well, haven't we all just been given loads of money recently? So why is it that the bins aren't being collected as often as they used to be? And I had to try and say, well, no, it's not new money, it's money that we would have otherwise had. We've got powers overspending it, and it's less money than we actually need, by which point obviously I completely lost this resident's interest in the topic. So there's a real challenge there that somehow there's a sense that Manchester's been given 6 billion, 8 billion, whatever it is, billions of money to plug all the gaps, where in fact we're actually seeing significant cuts in local government budgets, but we've just got the power to decide how we spend it. So there is a real political challenge, I think, for these metro mayors coming in. What are some of their opportunities and what might their strategy look like in terms of dealing with that? I think they need to focus on doing one or two things really well and not worrying about everything else. They need to make sure that what they do and what their vision and ambition is coming in as a new mayor is to be transformative. There's no point, in my view, having an agenda for devolution and having an agenda for the Northern Powerhouse if you're simply just going to take the same decisions that would have otherwise been taken by civil servants or London politicians. So you need to decide what areas are you going to transform, and I think the Resolutions Foundation report today gives a few insights on that. For me, they could be housing, they could be early years, it could be health in the case of Manchester where we've got huge devolution opportunities with health, but I think you need to show your public what difference you are making and constantly remind them of doing that. That you're doing that. And I think, as Jim said as well, you've got to do this in the environment of a kind of new politics world as well. I don't think it's going to be sufficient really to have politicians as usual kind of going about their business. These metro mayors will have huge burden of responsibility on their shoulders, and they need to prove themselves as being different kinds of politicians, non-establishment, outspoken, challenging the establishment where they need to, taking it to the grassroots, making sure there's real transparency there. So non-tribal I would absolutely agree with, and I think there is, I often say this when I get the opportunity at these platforms, but there is a real opportunity, a real challenge here in terms of how these group of metro mayors and city leaders are going to look, because when they're elected, I think the vast majority of them are going to be white middle class men, and that is a challenge for how this whole new politics is going to look. So I'm going to give a little shout out to Diva Mank, which is a new organisation set up in Manchester to try and promote women in devolution. So I would agree that these new metro mayors need to do their job well rather than just asking for new powers. But to complement what Jim was saying earlier, I would just give a shout out for one other aspect, which is a particular passion of mine. But we've heard a lot today about intra-inequalities and inter-inequalities in cities. And without having the ability to determine the skills and education of a local population, this agenda, in my view, will go nowhere. And the fact that education is being more and more centralised as every hour that passes, and we have no control locally over place planning, curriculum, support, intervening, raising standards, or any of those issues. And early years is also going in the opposite direction with national funding formulas and so on. So we're going to see the stripping back of the ability of local areas to reduce those inequalities. I think unless we shout louder about the need for devolution in education skills and early years, then our ability to meet the challenge that the Resolution Foundation has set out today will be greatly limited. So in conclusion, I would just say we need to set out to be, these new mayors need to set out to be ambitious and transformative. They need to pick their issues carefully and be strategic, but they've got a lot of big political hurdles to get over in order to take the public with them. So good luck to them doing that.
Great. Alex, that's a lot of challenges and hurdles. Hopefully you've got all the answers.
All the answers. No, some of the answers, but I think in 5 minutes, I just want to make 3 points. One is about why this isn't just important to the cities and the city regions. This matters to the UK, so echoing some of Jim's points. One is about how, as the Resolution Foundation has said, this is going to be about the places within the city regions. And third, a point about mayors and why actually it is very challenging. So I haven't got the answers there, but some more challenges to add to the debate. First, why this matters. This matters to the whole UK that we get this right. So as Jim said, 60% of global growth driven by about 600 cities. Around the world, cities are driving growth. In the UK, about 60% of private sector jobs are in cities. But we're a country where you've got far too many cities underperforming. So you've got some stars, London, there's some smaller cities like Cambridge doing incredibly well. We did a study looking at 330 European cities, 17 countries. And what we found is 9 out of 10 UK cities, this is including some of the smaller ones, 9 out of 10 are below the European average for productivity. 9 out of 10, and more than half of them are in the bottom quarter. And that's shocking. It has a huge impact on living standards. As Krugman said, productivity is not everything, but it's nearly everything. It has an enormous impact on what we can do in terms of increasing income, increasing opportunities for people. And it particularly affects the big cities. So if you look at some of the big cities, they've got incredibly low skills, they've got low productivity. Across the UK, we're the 3rd highest in Europe on concentrations of people with low skills. So Spain and Poland are ahead of us, and then it's us. Huge problems on skills, huge problems on productivity, and as a nation we have to fix this. And we can't just fix it by making the most of London and the smaller cities, because some people have said that to me before. Actually, to use one measure, tax, as just an indication of how places are doing. If you look at some of the smaller cities like Cambridge, they grew by 24% in terms of taxes between 2005, 2014-15. So 24% increase, that's huge. Manchester in that time only grew by 1%. But if you add up all the taxes that Manchester contributed, and you add up all the taxes that actually the 9 fastest growing small and medium-sized cities contributed, it's about the same actually. Manchester, city region, all of these city regions we're talking about, they've got scale. They impact far more people, far more jobs, far more businesses, and generate far more tax. So we need to make the most of the small places. But we have to get these city regions right. It matters to the UK economy as a whole, as well as to all the people who live there. And that's why devolution is so important, and that's my second point. So this really matters, because actually we've, for far too long, pretended that we've got the same issues everywhere. When people talk about the housing crisis, actually, often you can substitute London when people have a conversation about it, and it works. If you substituted the West Midlands or Liverpool City region, it doesn't work. Different challenges. And I think as the Resolution Foundation report shows really strongly, this is about thinking about not just the whole city region, but the places within that city region, and playing to the strengths of the different places within that city region, understanding the different roles. You need to make the most of some of the city centres, which in these city regions have grown. So actually the city centres, they've attracted lots of investment from some of the highest, most productive firms, lots of the knowledge-intensive firms. They've done well. But you need to also make the most of the areas around them. So somewhere like Oldham, which has got a regional science centre, it's got a great sixth form college, it's got a lifelong learning centre, it's got a university campus, it's got plenty of businesses. Making the most of Oldham's role within Greater Manchester, because actually the city region doesn't work without all the component parts, because that's where people travel from, that's where you get the skills, that's where you get the customers, that's where you get the businesses. If you don't make the most of the different roles places have within that city region, it doesn't work. You can't just base it on the city centre, you can't just base it on Oldham, it's about how it works together as an area. And mayors will need to be thinking about how a place works. The transport, the skills, the housing, progression within work, playing to the different strengths of places. And I think the Resolution Foundation report really highlights that. This is about the mayors not just doing things for the whole place, doing things for the whole the places within, because that's how the reality of the place works, of the city region. So final point, so if it matters to the UK, and actually it matters you've got devolution so you can respond to the individual places in those city regions, you do need these mayors. When we've done some surveys, they may not be wanted, but actually we surveyed some people and 57% of them said they would like a mayor with more powers than council leaders. So they want somebody who can take decisions. But actually if you look at the powers they don't necessarily have that many. So a third of people we spoke to said they wanted the mayor to improve healthcare. But it's actually only Manchester, Greater Manchester, that's got the power to do that. And actually they're relatively weak mayors, so 2/3 of council leaders can veto the budget, can veto decisions. They will be very reliant on conversations with local leaders. So there may be very high expectations that they will need to make sure they are rising to by working closely with local leaders. Now, I think there is a lot of hope, because actually it's not just about formal powers, it's about soft powers. The power to convene, the power to bring people together, the power to have national profile. That's true in all the studies done of mayors. It's also about picking, as Lucy said, 1 or 2 or 3 things and going for it. They don't have to be within your power, but you have to go for it, and you've got a directly elected mandate to do that. And actually, it's interesting on the non-tribal point, most mayors aren't tribal. They're focusing on things that make a difference, that get things done, and actually that cuts across party boundaries, and so it should. So I think focusing on a small number of things, making sure actually it's going to make a difference to the area, will be crucially important. There are a lot of political challenges to this, not least that they don't have some of those formal powers. But I think, as I've said, it matters to the UK as a whole, it matters to the places within it, that we get this right and really make the most of the mayors. Thank you.
That was great in terms of reminding us that big places matter, Manchester notwithstanding. That we need to understand the differences within those places, and that we need strong mayors, which we may or may not be getting versions of. And that's kind of the last point, bringing together quite a lot of what people have been saying here, which is that if we skip ahead 5 years and look back at where we are today, this is our view as an organisation, but what will really tell whether this is a transformational change for Britain rather than another bit of municipal tinkering is whether we look back and think that was the moment where we said it's not okay that we don't have real strategically focused particularly economic leadership outside of London. And if it delivers that, it will be worth almost anything else. Any of the other trade-offs, all of the painful political haggling that you and others have to get through to get us there, Jim, and that is kind of our big picture. Now, we're going to go over to you guys for questions, thoughts with question marks on the end, and others. There's a lady right at the front here to kick us off.
Hi there, I'm Rachel Lawrence from the New Economics Foundation, where I direct our work on communities and localities. It strikes me that there is a real tension between the different objectives we are hoping to achieve with devolution. And the one that worries me most, which is really well highlighted by the first presentation today, is the tension between a drive to achieve rapid GVA growth versus a drive to achieve higher employment. If you really want to go for very quick high GVA growth, as we've seen, the way you do that and the way that Manchester is currently trying to do that, which is very sensible, is to bring in the skills and the type of workforce that you need to generate high growth industries, and that is what the Manchester strategies are based on at the moment. We've done some research recently where we were told by very senior officials within Manchester City Council directly the kinds of people we want to live and work in Manchester are not going to want to live in the current housing stock we have. That's what's driving our plans to build new housing. And for me, that quote resonated with what Stephen said about the kinds of people who we know participate in a high growth economy. So for me, there's a real question of, if you set the objective for devolution as being generate a high growth economy quickly, does that actually fundamentally make it difficult to raise employment?
That sounds a bit like growth as an ethnic cleansing as an argument, but we'll come back to that as a controversial question. There's a question right at the back, next to Helen.
Hello, my name is Adam Feinberg, and I'm advisor on growth and public services. I'm also Mancunian.
Hey.
My family unfortunately moved from Manchester to South because of the opportunities available many decades ago in the North. And what I've seen since, and I think the figures show this, is that we've seen a lot of physical developments, we've seen a lot of housing developments, and we've heard about the decline in owner-occupation rates in Manchester. We've also seen, in terms of economic engagement in the labour market and general indices around well-being, we've seen a decline or a flat lining over the last 20 years. We've had good leadership, and that's, as I say, promoted the development of the physical infrastructure, but it hasn't addressed issues around intra-urban inequalities and overall well-being standards. If we're going to go with mayors on the basis of cities and their performance to date, and on the basis of making it a more inclusive city, for example, Manchester, are we really being honest about the analysis of the cities that we're backing?
Okay, great question. And then the gentleman standing at the back. It's suffered through often outstanding.
Thank you very much. Aaron McLachlan, I'm Local Government Officer at Citizens Advice, and we've got some analysis showing that something like 20% of GP's time is taken up with non-medical issues, or the results of non-medical issues, sort of debt and stress and so on that feed through. Resolving those would potentially help to save something like £400 million of the GP's budget nationally. So the question here is really to sort of, maybe a sort of prompt for Lucy is to say, look at some of these other ways of restructuring the sort of services and how they're provided, how you actually tackle the problems that are presenting, and making full use of the sort of voluntary sector and other partners, so that you can actually take with a fairly limited budget and get far more output and far more improvements in people's quality of life.
That's a great pitch for Citizens Advice to get a big Manchester contract. Thank you very much. Right, why don't we hit the first two questions together, which are basically, if with different hinges to them, about whether the kind of economic leadership we're going to get is going to be all about traditional growth in the city centre of middle class jobs and not reach out beyond that to the rest of the population. So Jim, do you want?
I'll say three quick things about those both questions. First of all, to remind everybody, it's not much more than 2 years since George Osborne first mentioned the phrase Northern Powerhouse, so I'm not sure citing evidence of what's happened the past 20 years is neither here nor there as to issues to do with the Northern Powerhouse and elected mayors. They should be chosen on the basis of what they say they're going to do about the future. Second thing to quickly add, in some ways, particularly the first question, I'd call that as a quality problem. The real reason, as I said at the start of my comments, why this agenda started is because for the whole of my life, massive underperformance of economic growth in the Midlands, by the way, not just the Midlands engine, which came as a result primarily of the sort of jealous consequence of the Northern Powerhouse. Is a fantastic development. The issues are exactly the same now. It's a quality problem. It is usually the case that employment is a lagging indicator of GDP growth, and if you can get sustainable GDP growth, the jobs will come. It's also relevant for this stuff about inequalities. Reading and the Thames, whatever they call it, west that way, is not part of London, but that place has been booming for the past 20 years, which is, I'm pretty sure, is because of London's success. And one shouldn't diminish all of that. Final thing notwithstanding, and it links to education and health issues and opportunity, and deep in my life, because of when I was educated, it's at the core of why devolution is so crucial. Rochdale is always the strongly cited example in Greater Manchester, but I went to primary and junior school in a place called Wythenshawe, which is probably worse than Rochdale. One of the most important things that's happened there the past 2 years is the extension of the tram system, which, amongst many other things which is needed for Wythenshawe, is probably a really important thing. And you can't magically solve these things overnight, and notwithstanding the really powerful stuff that was shown about if you can create employment everywhere, as I joked to Alex when I heard that said, it's not like you can wave some magic wand and just create jobs out of nothing. You've got to face realities and what is the value-added edge for some place to do something differently than it did before. So you can't just dream up things for the sake of it. I could rattle on a great length, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Alex?
I think really powerful points. This is going to take generations, and because some of this is about skills, and we know that early years matters, school matters, but actually some of the kind of training to help people adapt who are already in employment, and most people who will be in the workforce in 20 years are already in jobs, is also crucial. So some of this has to be about skills. There is no one thing you can do to boost city region growth. If there was, everyone would do that. You do need to make sure you're getting the external investment, getting some of these high-skilled jobs, because all the evidence we've looked at says the cities that aren't doing that are struggling to create as many jobs and to kind of sustain growth, which matters. Having said that, I think it's very clear that city regions also haven't done enough to make sure that there are benefits for everybody living in that area from some of that growth. Now, I think that's not an either or. It can't be an either or. If you just focus on the surrounding area to get that investment, you don't have some of those jobs. If you just go for the investment and don't think about the wider area, then clearly that's not working. And I think the referendum, one of the messages was that that's not okay. I don't think any mayor is going to be standing on a platform saying it's all about the city centre. I think the challenge for the mayors is if they say we're going to try and make sure that everybody benefits, that they do so in a way that actually recognises how business takes decisions. Because actually if business just took decisions on cost and could be tempted anywhere, you wouldn't have this many people in London, because frankly it's far too expensive to make sense if you're just thinking cost. So this is about working with the way business makes decisions, but policy can change. The way that you help people access work, progressing work, invest in skills, transport, housing, at all levels, is going to be the mix.
I mean, just to add on that, so the one, definitely do not want a growth versus shared growth trade-off, in a simplistic sense anyway. Secondly, if we look back at the last 30 years, it's not like we've had the growth but not had the shared bit. It's that we haven't had the growth in those three cities,
Yes,
and then that's been part of a failure on inclusivity. We'll do some work we'll probably publish in January just on what are they looking across all living in cities on a much smaller level. What are the areas that have had knowledge, have got the good jobs in the city centre, that have then seen that benefiting beyond that, and which the ones that have that have not done it. And that's the debate we need to get into, which is and that's actually the debate that's happening with mayors right across the world. I mean, you can literally have a template for mayoral election campaigns at the moment. They all start with, we need shared growth because we've got to spread it across the whole city, and then they have 3 bullet points, basically, most mayor's election campaigns. They don't manage the one sentence that Stephen had, but they more or less are on there, in the Anglosphere world anyway in particular. So hopefully they'll manage some of that. Now, Lucy, should we give citizens advice on massive contracts to write down debt in Manchester?
Well, I have no power whatsoever, I'm just an MP, but I can certainly put that bid in for you. But no, I mean, you make a really good point, and I think, for me, trying to reshape the way in which we use public budgets to switch to early intervention and prevention, I think is one of the key opportunities of devolution. And that is what Greater Manchester is certainly now looking at, with having health and social care integrated for the first time, with, I know it's had a bad press lately, but with things like troubled families, there's a huge kind of revamping of early years intervention as well, that started in Manchester, is now going across the whole of GM. I think that is the way in which you can transform public services, and for me, devolution has to be about that, or it's not about anything at all. And just to add to a couple of the points, seeing as lots of people were asking about Manchester, Adam, I mean, I grew up in Manchester, like Jim as well, and when I left school, comprehensive school like Jim as well, there were very little opportunities for me either, and I moved to London for a few years, but 20 years later, is it? I don't know, maybe something like that.
I'm afraid so.
There's many more opportunities.
In my case, it's less than
that. Yeah, of course, yeah, 15 years in your case. There are many more opportunities, and many more people do stay in Manchester, and I think it's a sort of oversimplistic analysis to say, have we just invested in the physical infrastructure and we've not invested in people? They go hand in hand. It is a long process, but yes, I mean, even within my area, my constituency, which many of my MP colleagues sort of resent Manchester Central, that gets everything. That's not the case at all, but places like Moston or Openshaw would probably feel just as left behind as places like Rochdale or Wythenshawe. But then you look at the changes that have happened in Hume over the last 20 years, the changes that have happened in Beswick and East Manchester, and they are utterly transformational, and they are the same communities living there as they were 20 years ago. But that's why we do need to be able to invest in the indigenous populations, if you like, through education, early intervention and early years sort of programmes as well.
That was indigenous and the non-controversial.
Well,
Can we do a bit of challenge to our Manchester panel, which is are we not at all worried about the people of Greater Manchester reading in the papers and seeing on the news lots of very positive coverage of Manchester, including your 6 billion devolve lots of extra cash point, and then asking why they're not seeing that in their lives?
Well,
and then maybe the PR. Are we not worried? I'm slightly worried that the PR gets ahead of the substance, for the reason Jim rightly points out. This is going to take years to start turning things around, and that we might be better dialing down the PR than dialing up some of this controversial.
Well, I mean, I'll start off, but just because I get it on the doorstep. I mean, you get that on the doorstep. At the same time that all this is happening, bin collections are now going to fortnightly. Do you know what I mean? That's what people actually care about. the roads are covered in litter, and the police won't come if they've been burgled. That's what people will tell you at the same time as they are seeing that. But at the same time, I would say on the whole, there is a great deal of pride in a lot of the transformation. It has been happening over decades. I think why Manchester is a sort of unique case is because the combined authority, the 10 local authorities, have worked together for 25 years. So Media City in Salford, Coronation Street in Trafford, the airport, Oldham was some examples were given earlier. So there is a lot of good things
There's
to
some
note.
good things to be PR
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
Jim?
Two comments. Actually, I didn't think I'd have a chance to talk about antimicrobial resistance in my review at this forum, but in answer to what the gentleman at the back said before, one of the strongest recommendations we made in that is to encourage all Western countries to make it compulsory by 2020 to not allow an antibiotic to be prescribed unless it had gone through a diagnostic test. And amongst the many advantages of that is we need to cut these idiotic waiting lines that are amongst many things that are pressurising our health service. There's evidence that at least 50% of antibiotics prescribed in all Western countries are actually not necessary. We have these idiotic things that dominate our lives, yet we still have an educated guess, and we all put pressure on our doctors as to give us an antibiotic when we've got, a little sore toothache. So that's, the power of technology to solve those things is enormous. I wasn't asked about that, but there you go. On this issue, I'd also call it a sort of quality, same thing as I said, it's a sort of quality problem. On one level, it is ridiculous. Have you got beaten up when you went to Old Trafford?
No, lots of times in Manchester. It's just we spend all our time Manchester, as you say,
In my lifetime, we've not spent all our lives.
That's true.
All right, just give us a few.
It is a really good thing why they have got the attention they've got, because they are the people that have driven this agenda. If it would not have been for Howard Bernstein and Richard Lees and a few of their colleagues, we would not be sitting here today. And they are ahead of London. And I often used to talk to Boris and his role and all his advisors, like, what is the matter with you guys? Why can you not think of things the way these guys are doing? So we should not, and I say that with the forcefulness I'm saying, because it is an issue that is sensitive with the new leadership of this country, as you can see. And it's not something that should be detracted from, because they are driving, or have done, this agenda, which is crucial to the future of a more balanced country.
What is the chance?
The second thing I would say against that, as I say to Howard and Richard all the time, if in 15 years the three of us go together on a walk 1.5 miles in any direction from the centre of Manchester, and you haven't got more people looking as though they've got enjoyable lives than they've got today, we won't have succeeded. But that is not a reason to decry the focus that Manchester's got, because they have driven this. There would be no Midlands engine if it wouldn't have been for the way. What about us?
There'd be no devolution at all.
Liverpool wouldn't have got, Liverpool started from this because they were like, hang on a minute, what about us? And it's like, okay, Joe and all your colleagues, you show some of the leadership and desire for responsibility that Manchester's doing, and you can get it. And look what's happened with Liverpool 18 months later. Guys in the North East, they stopped feeling so scared of taking initiative and show the same kind of combined leadership and drive, they'll get the same things. But to sort of have this thing that's becoming a bit of a current thing, we can't let Manchester be so dominant, it is nonsense, because without what they're driving, there would be no devolution agenda in town.
On a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say is the chance of the country's new leadership following the strong sales pitch you've just given?
It's not a sales pitch, it's reality.
It's inside substance, that's the majority of the term.
I think partly because of personalities, and because the guys in the Midlands have taken their own game to a very different position. It is quite clear that the Midlands engine is going to get more attention going forward. And I think because of, this is why I'm eager to say it in such bluntness, because of some of the media issues around it, this perception that Manchester gets too much is one that's there, and it is not justified. They get it because they've driven the case for having it. You said yourself about health. The only reason why health has been developed to Greater Manchester is they're the only people that have had the kahunas to want to do it. I was in the centre of all of these discussions with every region, and we raised health with it, and everybody's like, oh no, far too difficult. And that's the reality.
Great, let's get another set of questions from you guys. We should have some from this side. There's ladies and gentlemen next to each other who could take turns with a mic.
I'm going to stand because I can't see you otherwise. Thank you, my name's Claudia Schwallies from Populous. My question is to do with the kind of political challenge and the expectations challenge that we've been talking about.